and he's going to be speaking to us on Jonah. So isn't that the topic I gave you? All right. We have a microphone. Do you have this mic for him? We have a lapel for you. Thank you, Brother Miller. You have about 30 minutes.
And Patrick is getting it for you. Hey, Justin, would you come up and get one for me? Here's another one. Turn in your Bibles to the book of Jonah. We might have time for that one, Justin. Tonight, if you think Jonah getting swallowed by a whale and surviving was a miracle, we're going to do another miracle tonight because we're going to cover the whole book in one night. It is not easy to do that. By the way, who can I get to come? Jordan, would you do this for me and pass these out? Back in 1989, 1990, I spent a whole quarter on the book of Jonah. So this is going to be observing the Passover with regard to Jonah. We're just going to pass right over it. Now, what Jordan's passing out is not one for everybody. It's one for every family represented. If you came as a couple, please just take one. I'm not sure how many that we have or if we have enough. But we're going to hope that as a husband and a wife, you can share and not be fussing about it. So please get just one if you're a couple. I have a cartoon here where this woman's answering the door, and it's her husband. Her husband's name is Jonah. She said, "Look, Jonah, you're 3 days late. You are covered with slime. You smell like a fish. Now, what kind of story do you expect me to swallow this time?" And I liked what this bulletin article I ran across said. A Bible teacher asked her young students, "What do you learn from the story of Jonah and the whale?" A little girl said, "People make whales sick." A little boy said that he learned that you can't keep a good man down. Well, Brother Tom, I'm going to ask you to read that passage in Matthew 12. You all don't have to turn to Matthew 12. I'm going to ask Brother Tom to read this. I'm going to ask him to read it loud enough that everybody can hear, no matter where you are sitting. So read to the person furthest away from you. And this has to do with something Jesus said about what we're going to study tonight. Tom, go ahead. Matthew chapter 12, 39 and 40.
This will be coming from the New King James Version. Yet he answered and said unto them, An evil and adulterous generation speaks after a sign. Also a sign will be given to it except the sign of the pulpit, the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth.
So how do you know that this story really happened? And it's not just a fable of some sort. How do you know that for a fact? Jesus said it happened. If Jesus said it happened, then it happened. Now, as a matter of fact, this whole business of getting swallowed by a big honking marine critter of some sort is not actually a miracle. That's really not the miracle in this story. James Bartley, 21 years old, 1891, Falkland Islands. He was swallowed by a sperm whale. And you can read about that in the Orlando Sentinel. The spring of 1966, there was an article about James Bartley being swallowed by a sperm whale. So it can happen. An English fisherman, 1936, he was 48 hours in a whale shark, and he lost his hair, and his skin was yellowed by that experience. You can find out about that in a book called Harmony of Science and Scriptures by Harry Rimmer. Well, let's take a look at the book of Jonah. I just wanted to make sure that we pointed out at the very beginning that this is not such a difficult tale to swallow. The book of Jonah. I want you to take a look, and obviously we don't have a lot of time here, so I'm going to ask you to help me out, and I want us to think out loud together about this. I want you to look at verse 2. I want you to look at verse 3 of the very first chapter, and I want you to notice there are two verbs there. One's a command, and then the other is Jonah's response to the command. Different forms of the same verb. What's the verb? What did he have to do before he went? He had to get up. He had to arise. Okay, the Lord tells him to arise. And then look at what he did in verse 3. He arose. So if you do what God said, that's obedience, right? Did he obey? The Lord said, arise, and he arose. So what's the big deal about that? What's the problem with that? Okay, he went in the wrong direction. That's one of the reasons why I had this copy of this map circulated. I'm a visual learner. I don't know how many of you are blessed with the ability to learn good by audible sounds, but I'm a visual learner. I'd much rather see a picture. Now, what's the difference between where he went and where he was supposed to go? Where was he supposed to go? Okay, Nineveh. Okay, Nineveh. Now, locate Nineveh on that map. Now, where'd he go? What's the difference between the location of those two? Yeah, they're far apart. One's one direction, one is the other direction. So he hears what the Lord tells him to do. There's no doubt about that. He got the message. There's no question about that. Now, some people don't do what the Lord said because they haven't heard what the Lord's said. That's, by the way, our job, to help educate people about what the Lord has said in regard to us and how we need to respond to Him. God communicated to him, and he heard what God said. And he did respond. He arose, but he went the opposite direction. So, when we don't do what the Lord wants us to do, when we know what the Lord wants us to do, what's our problem? What will sometimes, and there's more than one answer to that question, what is it sometimes that causes us to disobey when we know full well how we should obey? Fear, okay. Sometimes we think what we are asked to do is above and beyond us. Maybe it's something that we've never experienced before. How about something else that might cause us not to do what the Lord said? Rebellion. Okay, rebellion, knowing full well what we're supposed to do and then not doing it. Somebody mentioned something else? Disagreement. Okay. Let's admit that we don't know everything that was going on in the thinker and the feeler of Jonah. Okay. Now I think we're going to get some hint, a little bit of a revelation here as you work through the book. But he obviously had a problem with what God told him to do, because he chose, knowing full well what he should do, he chose not to do it. He actually ran in the opposite direction. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 14 and verse 25, there are two words used to describe Jonah, and it gives you a little bit of a sense of timing as well, because we're talking here about the 700s BC. But there are two words to describe Jonah in 2 Kings 14. One is servant, and the other is prophet. So he's a servant of God, and he's a prophet of God. but yet he disobeys God. What does that tell you about the people of God? What does that tell you about us? He's a servant of God, a prophet of God. He was told what to do, but he didn't do it. What does that tell you about us human beings? Okay, sinful. We can make sinful choices. What else does it tell you? Free will. Just because God wills something doesn't mean that we embrace that will. So sometimes we will choose not to do what the Lord's told us to do. Now remember, this is not your average ordinary Joe or Jonah. This was a servant of God, a prophet of God. I am sad to report this, but it is a reality, and I think we all need to realize this. When it comes to human beings, we are capable of doing anything. Literally. We are capable of doing anything. Even raising a defiant fist in the face of God. Turning our back on God, walking away from God. And our problem isn't that we don't know, even in the face of knowledge of what God wills, it is possible, we are capable as human beings to not do the Lord's will. I don't know how long you've been a Christian. I don't know how long that you've been exposed to life in the church. But the reality is there are people who severely disappoint us. People that we think highly of, people that we've respected. Sometimes it's even somebody's father, somebody's mother, or somebody's child. I'm very hesitant about using universal terminology, things like all, every, never. But in this case, any human being is capable of doing anything. Don't doubt the power of selfishness and self-will and the influence of Satan in a person's life. Even if they're a preacher or an elder or your mother or your son or your daughter. That's why we're constantly advised in Scripture about keeping our ears open, listening to the will of God, being humble, embracing the will of God, receiving with meekness the implanted word that's able to save our souls, James 1:21. Here's Jonah, a man of God, a servant of God, a prophet of God, and he chose not to do what the Lord told him to do. If it could happen to Jonah in the 8th century BC, it can happen to me, and it can happen to you. And the only way to stop that is you stop it. You, me, not letting that happen. When everybody's here in this big room in this building on a Sunday morning, and typically they're kind of cleaned up, dressed pretty decent, and we think everything's fine. When the reality sometimes is there are some internal burdens and struggles and stresses inside of people sitting in this very room where they are maybe hanging on the edge, about to snap, and maybe even becoming as rebellious, as disappointing to God as Jonah was. That's why we need to make sure we keep encouraging one another and reminding one another of what the Lord wants us to be and how the Lord wants us to behave. Well, he's in the boat, and in chapter 1, the storm gets pretty bad, but Jonah ends up getting tossed out. By the way, is Jonah here tonight? Is Jonah here tonight? I want to get a picture of holding him in the boat, and I'll catch a few people's attention on Facebook by talking about how we chose not to throw Jonah out of the boat. Jonah gets thrown out of the boat and gets swallowed by the big fish, and of course we're very familiar with that story. Now, look at verse 17 of chapter 1. There's a big honking fish, okay, a great fish, and the great fish swallowed Jonah. Now, it's not a miracle for a human being to be swallowed by a big honking marine critter. I've already cited to you 2 examples. But what in the world was that big honking fish doing right there at that location? And why would he swallow Jonah when there were probably other things around there in the area that he could have swallowed? But he was right there at that time and swallowed Jonah. That's the miracle. God prepared the fish, that big honking fish, to be right where it needed to be at the right time. Now, imagine verse 17, that same verse. Imagine 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. Well, chapter 2. So what's he do in the fish? In that big honking fish, what's he do? Okay, he prays. Now, do you find it interesting what he prays about? Now, let's just look a little bit at chapter 2. I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. You know, one of the real blessings of burdens is we're driven sometimes to our knees and we cry out to God like we've never cried out to him before. I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your billows and your waves passed over me. Then I said, I have been cast out of your sight. Yet I look again toward your holy temple. The water surrounded me, even to my soul. The deep closed around me. Weeds are wrapped around my head. See how detailed this prayer is? See, that's the difference between passionate prayer and ritual prayer. Canned prayer. Just saying your prayers. He talks specifically to God about what he's experienced. Definitely a part of passionate praying. Well, if you take a look at the last couple of verses there in chapter 1, how would you summarize this prayer? What is he praying about? What's prompting this prayer? Anybody? Look at the whole prayer, but especially zero in on those last couple of verses. Okay, his predicament. How does he feel about his predicament? It's been a scary thing. Okay. Look at the last phrase down in verse 9. Salvation is of the Lord. This is a prayer of praise and thanksgiving in the belly of a big honking fish. When he's done the only thing that he feels he can do in a plight like this. God, recognizing God and his total dependence upon God and his thankfulness that God has saved him. Now, it wasn't by throwing the net down and pulling him back into the boat. I'm not sure that would have been as effective as what he experienced for 3 days and 3 nights. He was eating some humble pie in that fish because he had the gall to hear God clearly, understand what God said, and not do it. This was his schoolhouse. The big honking fish was his schoolhouse. And he's on a learning curve, and it's a real fast learning curve. As a matter of fact, if you look down there at verse 10, what was graduation like out of this school of experience? Boy, the Lord spoke to the fish. See, God has control not just in the spirit realm, where we read about demons being exorcised and things like that, but he has total control and he's sovereign over the physical world as well, the natural world as well. So the Lord speaks to the fish, but the fish doesn't go run somewhere else and do something else. What's the fish do? The fish did what Jonah didn't do. Jonah did not obey God, the fish did. Isn't that a pretty sad commentary on us human beings? That the creatures of the natural world, when commanded by God, respond. And sometimes we won't. And our problem is that free will that we don't always use to honor God. So there you've got 2 chapters. Well, chapter 3. Here we go again. Chapter 3, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, now I want you to notice, remember those 2 words in chapter 1, in verse 2 and verse 3. Different tenses of the same verb. Now, look here at chapter 3 and look at what it says in verse 2 and in verse 3. Different tenses of the same verb. God tells him to arise, to go to Nineveh, and preach the message. Now, where's he going to get this message from, by the way? He's going to get it from the Lord. Where should we today get our message to share with others? God. That's where we need to get our message. We are totally dependent upon God to be able to have the message that's accurate, that's true, that's right and appropriate for whatever time it is in our life. So he's told to go to Nineveh and to preach. Now, this is a significant city. This is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian people were a barbaric, militaristic, awful, heathen people. Nineveh's the capital. But God sends a Jewish prophet to this awful place in Nineveh. And what does God want for the city? He wants what? He wants them to repent. He wants them. Now here, this is interesting. A Jewish prophet, a Gentile country. So why would God be concerned with these Gentile people? They're not in covenant relationship with him. Why is he concerned with them? I'll have to admit, when I first started going to church, when I was 15 years old and started reading the Bible, it was this whole thing was very hard for me to understand about God and God's relationship with the Jewish people. And then, I had questions. I had a lot of ignorance. I still have a lot of ignorance, but I had even more back then. And I just wondered about, well, what about the Gentile people? Does God have any concern for the Gentile people here in the 8th century BC? Well, that's why he sends Jonah there. Isn't it interesting that maybe this is a wake-up call for us as we come to appreciate the universal love and concern of God for who? Everybody. Every single person. God has a universal love for those who are created in his image and exist in his likeness. That's not just you and me. That's everybody in Villa Rica, everybody in Carroll County, everybody in the state of Georgia, everybody in our country. And that even includes these illegal immigrants who crossed into our border and violated our laws. They have a soul too. And the people who have lived in a culture very different than your culture in our country. There's an Appalachian culture. There's a Southwest culture. There's a Southeast culture. You know, people are raised in different cultures, and they have different experiences that form their thoughts and their perspectives and their values and how they live. Not everybody is like us. Well, Jonah just didn't have a whole lot of interest in the people in that Assyrian empire. And so he really struggled with going there. He didn't want to go there. It took the experience in that great fish and that great fish spitting him out to convince him, get moving, Jonah, and do what I'm telling you to do. Well, so what happens when he goes to Nineveh and he preaches? Now, by the way, what is the message that he preaches, that God gives him? You know, God says, you go and you preach the message that I give you. What was the message? I think it was 8 words. Okay. They're going to be destroyed. Well, a message that shook them up. Now, this heathen, barbaric, militaristic people, and they're shaken by the preaching and the message of Jonah. Now, I really do suspicion that part of what helped his effectiveness was his appearance. I don't know that for a fact, but spending 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a big, great fish has got to have an effect on your skin, your hair, your general appearance. And did the word get out? Did the word spread? Well, he's very effective, and the people are very penitent. Look there at verse 7 in chapter 3. He caused it to be proclaimed and published throughout Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink water. You get it? This is wholesale, from deep within, penitence. They respond positively. Verse 10 says, then God saw their works, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. Well, how does Jonah respond in chapter 4? Now, wait a minute. Okay, we bring, we all bring ourselves here Sunday. Patrick preaches a sermon. Half the church responds to the invitation. No, 7/8 of the church. We're going to give a few people the stubbornness that they would reject it. 7/8 of the church responds. And by the way, I've heard some cases where churches have struggled sometimes, and there's been a huge response because of some really good, appropriate preaching at the right time because of what that church was experiencing. And then Patrick gets mad because all these people respond to the invitation. Would that be crazy or what? Does that seem odd? Well, what's odder, the 7/8 responding to the invitation or Patrick responding the way I suggested he might respond? If he was like Jonah. Jonah has this great success. He goes and he holds a gospel meeting in Nineveh, and he has throngs of people who are penitent, and he's upset. And the Lord asks him a good question in verse 4 of chapter 4. Is it right for you to be angry? Now, again, look there in verse 9 of chapter 4. Then God said, is it right for you to be angry? This time it's about a plant. God had this plant grow up, this gourd around, and when he loses the shade of the gourd, he's all cranked up again, and he's angry. What's Jonah's problem? Well, look here at verses 10 and 11 at the end of the book. But the Lord said, you've had pity on the plant for which you have not labored, nor made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. And should I not have pity on Nineveh, that great city in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern their right hand from their left, and much livestock? He didn't have compassion. He didn't have pity. Who didn't he have compassion or pity for? People. Human beings that were living in the image of God and after his likeness. And he didn't have compassion for them. Here is a powerful message from this book for all of us. We need to be compassionate toward all that God has compassion for. It doesn't matter what their skin color is, whether or not they can speak our language, or what their cultural background might be. We need to have pity and compassion on people who are not right with God. And when we have compassion and pity for people who are not right with God, we will do everything we can to help them to find the Lord in their life. Jonah did not have that compassion and pity, and he was a servant and a prophet of God. We can be the same way. That was my alarm. Thank you very much for participating in class. I hope that there's a personal application we can make